When I was just 12 years old, I walked into the tiny arcade at my local taxi depot and discovered Taito's Roston for the very first time. I was a child of the 80s and had always been drawn to the Conan the Barbarian epics, being a fan of the original movie at an extremely young age. Roston had embodied that story in video game form, a tale of steel and magic and all the monsters you could slay until your heart's content. This is the Rastan Saga. That first game enthralled me instantly. The character, the setting, the mythical enemies, it was all so very much my style. Even better, it was set to some truly unique and memorable music. The kind of stuff that once you get it stuck in your head, it's there for days. I loved the way it was designed too. Your barbarian was capable of attacking high and low as you'd expect, but also up and down even during jumps, giving you an edge against enemies above and below you. The stages were linear in their progression, always a fight to get to a tower that would contain a boss battle. You also had various power-ups to collect, from armor to help you better absorb damage, to items that helped your score. The gameplay was a challenge to say the least. You didn't get an easy out with being able to continue exactly where you died. There was a checkpoint style system where you needed to make it to a certain point in the level before you could continue there, making some of the later areas quite tough. I wasn't able to beat the arcade game right then and there, but it made its mark on me big time. It was one of those games I was really hoping would come home without too many compromises. You can imagine my surprise when I go over to my friend's house in the summer of 1989 and he shows me his brand new Master System game, Roston. Holy crap, there it was! The game I had been wanting at home for 2 years was finally here, and I was so excited to get it in and see how it fared. You also can imagine my surprise when I first saw that the Sega Master System had done the game quite a bit of justice. Like most arcade-to-home translations back then, there were some compromises in the color, detail, and sprite size, but otherwise the Master System nailed the overall look and feel of the arcade classic. I was also looking for the soundtrack to stay similar, and the Master System doesn't disappoint there either. I love the way this sounds, and even though there are only a handful of tracks, they are so distinctive that you can't help but to enjoy it. Shockingly, despite not having a Japanese release, the Master System version of Roston also has an FM alternative soundtrack if you have the means to access it. Emulators and other devices can often do this in their options menu, so be sure to enable it if you use them. A few years later, I would come across the sequel, Rastan Saga II, on the Sega Genesis. Something was amiss, however, because I had seen and played this game earlier in the arcade, and it wasn't called Rastan Saga II. And sure enough, I discovered that the US localization of this in the arcade had been called Naster Warrior, so the sequel had been there the entire time, and I had no clue at all. Unfortunately, no matter which version of this you play, it simply isn't the same game the original Roston was. The character looks goofy, the music isn't nearly as good, and the cheap boss fights are complete bullshit. It keeps many of the same cool features like weapon upgrades, and the new blocking mechanic with your shield can be really helpful, but it just lacks the first game's appeal and playability. And again, the in-your-face boss battles really are a nightmare, particularly later in the game. They have height, reach, and damage advantages that can run through your entire allotted continues in a single go. The lone positive of the arcade version is the ability to play in 2-player simultaneous co-op. The Genesis version of this is actually quite close to the arcade source material, right down to the sprite size and much of the stage design. There's a PC Engine version that is quite faithful to the arcade version as well. Both the Genesis and PC Engine version omit the 2-player mode. With my disappointment in Rastan Saga 2, so died my interest in the series. I had not enjoyed that game very much, so I moved on to bigger and better games of the 16-bit era. Years would pass until the summer of 1999, and I was working for Pepsi-Cola Bottling Company. I was trading out a couple of really old vending machines at an amusement retailer that sold things like pool tables and arcade machines. The warehouse-style setup was mesmerizing, loaded with arcade games from the last decade. As I walked around looking at the machines, I stumbled upon a shocking cabinet called Warrior Blade. This dual-screen cabinet was huge, roughly the size of 2 small cabinets that were set side by side. And there, right below the name, was the subtitle, Rastan Saga Episode III. What the heck? There was a Part 3?
Beschütze mich und bekämpfe den Feind.
There sure was. Apparently Taito developed and released this sequel in 1991, but due to the rather unorthodox cabinet, it didn't get spread around very much. The terrible thing is, this was actually a really good game. With Rastan Saga 2 failing to do as well as the first game, Taito decided it was time for a shakeup, and they completely changed the structure, design, and ultimately the genre of the series. This was now much more akin to the Golden Axe series of games, a 2-player co-op hack-and-slash beat-em-up that allows you to use mob-crushing magic attacks in addition to your weapon power-ups. The visuals would also get a major overhaul in the process, now also looking like something Sega would have made around that time. The playable characters and enemy sprites are huge, well detailed, and superbly animated. The backgrounds aren't particularly great in regards to features like parallax scrolling or set pieces, but they do fit the narrative well and provide a good backdrop to the action. The sound effects are really nice, with lots of voice work, grunts, and groans to express the on-screen action. Unfortunately, the soundtrack is somewhat subdued and really gets lost among the other sound effects. I really wanted this to be a true continuation of the music from the first game, but it really fails to live up to those lofty expectations. There are also some new design elements I really enjoyed here, including the ability to play as 3 separate characters with very different weapons, as well as the ability to approach each level in whatever way you see fit. After you defeat the first stage, you get to move on to other stages on your terms. Warrior Blade is a fast-playing, easy-to-get-into affair that is quite a bit more pick-up-and-play than the previous entries. If you enjoyed Sega's Golden Axe games, you likely will love this one. Sadly, Warrior Blade was never brought home on its own, and is only seen release in one compilation, Taito Memories 2 Gekken, that was released on the Japanese PlayStation 2. MAME is here to the rescue once again, however, and does a fine job emulating the dual-screen arcade.
Erkenn deine Grenzen.
Wahrheit, beschütze mich und bekämpfe den Feind.
Taito made many great arcade games from my youth, and Roston is definitely one of my favorite among them. From the arcade original to the fantastic Master System release, I always found its Conan the Barbarian inspired content fun and interesting. While the second game in the series failed to grab me the same way, I was really happy to discover the third game and see that the old Barbarian still had some life left in him. If you haven't played these games, I highly advise that you do. They are indeed throwbacks to a different era, but so strongly produced, they hold up well even now. I think many of you will agree. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.